Hi, this is John Auker with JamPlay.com, and I get asked all the time about different chord qualities, how they're constructed, and how to make sense of it all. In this quick lesson, I'm going to show you a few tricks that will help you figure out your chords and help you make sense of what you're playing. I'll show you a couple chord progressions, and then we'll break each chord down so that we can make some sense out of them. Let's check out the first progression, and then I'll break it down for you. Alright, so let's take a look at how this chord progression works and how these chords are formed here. So first I've got a G major chord. Now, in every chord we have a root. That's usually the name of the chord, and it's often the lowest note in the chord. So for our purposes here, we have a G on the low E string. That gives us the name of the chord. Now this chord is also a major chord. Now what that means is it has a third that is 2 whole steps away from the root. So if we take a look at that, we can find a third of a chord coming from our open G string by doing a whole step to A and then a whole step to B. That gives us the major third. Another element in our chords is a fifth. The fifth is 7 half steps away from our root. So I could find the fifth just by doing a G here on the low E string and doing 7 frets above that. 3 to 10. That's 7 frets. That is a D note. So in our G chord we have a G, a B, which is the third, a D, which is the fifth, a root, another third, and then another root. So that's how the G chord is constructed here. Now, the second chord is called a G augmented chord. That sounds like this. This might be sort of unfamiliar, so let's talk about what makes a chord augmented. Well, an augmented chord is a major chord, except we now raise the fifth by 1 half step. So remember how we talked about root, third, fifth, root, third, root. So we're going to take the fifth of the chord here, that D string, and just raise it by 1 fret by placing our index finger on the first fret of that string. There's our augmented chord. The third chord in our progression is an E minor chord. Alright, well, what's the difference between major and minor? Well, we talked about how a major chord has a third that is 2 whole steps away from the root. Well, now a minor chord has a third that is 1.5 steps away from the root. So that is 3 frets. So if we took our open E and just try to find the third there by going up 3 frets, we would find that our third of this chord is G. So in E minor, we need a G to fill out that minor chord. And there's what we've got. So we have G, G augmented, E minor. The next chord is a G7. So how do we go from just a regular G chord to a G7? Well, a G7 has the root, third, and fifth, and now it has the 7th, which is a whole step below the root. The easiest way to find a note like that is to take the highest root you can find. In this case, it's on the high E string on the 3rd fret, our G. We take that note and we just move it down 1 whole step. And now we have an F, which gives us our G7 chord. So the notes are G for the root, B for the 3rd, D for the 5th, and F for our 7th in this chord. Okay, our next chord in the progression is a C chord. That is a C major chord. Again, we've talked about how a major chord needs a third that is 2 whole steps above the root, and we've got that in our chord here. So if we took our C, say right here, and we found a note 2 whole steps away, 1, 2, we now have the E, which is the major third of our C chord. Last, we have a D chord in this progression. So this chord has D as our root, and it has a note a major third away from D, which is F sharp. D, whole step away, E, whole step away, F sharp. So there is our D major chord. So there are all the chords in this progression, and we've also gone through how these chords work, how they're constructed from the root to the third to the fifth and to the seventh. Okay, so let's take a look at our next progression. This progression is quite a bit more complex, but we'll start out with the same basic principles by identifying the different notes in different chords. Okay, so the first chord in this progression is called a B flat 13. Now, that's a B flat for the root, a seventh, a whole step below the root, the third of the chord, and then the 13th. Now, a 13th is an extension on a 7th chord. And this particular extension is the 13th note away from the root. So if I played, for example, a B flat Mixolydian scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, that note there, the G, is the 13th note away from the B flat that I started with. So that's how that B flat 13 chord works. Next up, we have an E9 chord. So this is another dominant 7th chord. E is now my root, and I have a 9th extension on there. So that's the 9th note away from the E. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. After that, I move it down to an E flat 9 chord. It's the same shape, same concept, except now my root is the E flat. Okay, after that we move to a C13. This is the same as the B flat 13, just 1 whole step higher. And it's the same idea. We have our C as our root, a flat 7, a third, and our 13. Again, the 13th note away from the root. Now on this, I move the extension around. So, I went from a 13, and then I lowered that 13 by a half step. That makes it a flat 13. After that, the progression just goes to a normal C7 chord. That's root, 7, 3, 5. After that C7 chord, we move to an F9 chord. So that was the same as the E9 and the E flat 9. So we have a dominant 7th chord, root, 3, flat 7, 9. Again, that extension is the 9th note away from the root. After that F9 chord, we move back to the B flat 13 chord. After that B flat 13, we move to a G7 flat 9 chord. Alright, so how is that G7 flat 9 constructed? Well, We have the root on our 5th string, the 3rd on the 4th string, the flat 7 on the 3rd string. But now instead of having the natural 9 like we had on our F9 chord and on our E9 chord and our E flat 9 chord, we're going to take that 9 and move it down another half step, make it a flat 9. So there is the flat 9 chord. That's how that works. Next we have a C minor 7. The root on the low E string. Then we have flat 7, flat 3, and 5. After that C minor 7, we get to an F7 sharp 9. Let's take a look at that chord. So we have F as our root, then we have a 3rd, then we have another flat 7. And now, instead of doing the natural 9 like we had before on our F9 chord, we move that 9 up 1 fret and it becomes a sharp 9. After that chord, we have an F7 with a flat 9. And then to wrap it up, we get back to that B flat 13. While these chords are a little bit more complex, we've been able to look now at how they're constructed and hopefully make some more sense out of them.